Here are 5 ways top engineers get punchy mixes. You're gonna learn how to take a track from this to this so keep watching if you want to mix professional sounding music that pops out of the speakers. Later in this video, I'm also going to share the #1 mistake people make when it comes to getting punchy mixes, so make sure to stick around for the entire lesson. Tip number 1, emphasize transient energy. Transients are the sudden loud bursts of energy at the start of a sound. The hit of a snare drum, the initial impact of a guitar strum, the hard consonants on a vocal.
I can hear your body calling.
You can use different tools like transient shapers and compressors to emphasize the transient energy and make the sound punchier. For example, let's use a transient shaper to make this snare hit just a bit harder. Transient shapers come in all different shapes and sizes, but at the core of every one of them, you get independent control over the attack and the sustain of a sound. Let's use a transient shaper to make this percussion track pop a bit more. You can use slow attack compression to emphasize transient energy as well. For example, let's use slow attack compression to make this kick drum a bit punchier. The slow attack time allows the transient to pass through the compressor before it turns down the sustain of the sound, resulting in a punchier, more impactful effect. Transient shapers and compressors each have their own sonic characteristics and sound a bit different. For example, listen to how transient shaping affects this snare drum differently than slow attack compression does. Now, there's no right or wrong here. It's just up to you as the engineer to decide which tool you want to use to get the sound you want to achieve. Sometimes that means experimenting with a few different tools, but some circumstances might call for an even deeper level of control. Tip number 2, get selective. Multi-band transient shapers and transient EQs can allow you to isolate transient energy just in specific parts of the frequency spectrum. For example, let's use multi-band transient shaping to make the kick and snare punchier in this drum loop while leaving the hi-hats unaffected. Now let's use the same principle to make the pick attack on this guitar pop out a bit more. A tool like Split EQ can allow you to EQ the transient energy of a sound without affecting the tone or the sustain. For example, listen to how much punchier these drums sound when we boost some key frequencies on the transients while leaving the sustain untouched. Now let's use the same concept to emphasize the pick attack on this guitar. There are plenty of tools out there that can perform similar functions. You'll just have to do a little bit of research. But in some scenarios, you might need to take a different approach. Tip number 3, reinforce or replace. Ideally, punch starts in production. If performance, recording techniques, sound selection, and instrument arrangement are all on point, you should already be pretty close to your desired level of punch before you get to the mix. But sometimes, you might get drum tracks that were poorly recorded and seem like they're just gonna need a lot of heavy lifting with noise gating and EQ and compression in order to get them to really punch. You can always try replacing the drums altogether or layering in a sample. For example, let's make these drums punchier by replacing the kick, snare, and toms. Now, if you prefer to keep some of the original character of the drum, you can always blend the recording and the sample to taste. Again, ideally you get this right at the source with proper sound selection and recording technique. Before we get to the next tip, I wanted to quickly share some exciting news with you. We've partnered with Mastering the Mix to share free access to one of their most popular plugins with our YouTube community. The plugin is called Expose. It usually costs $65, and the basic premise of this plugin is that it will instantly tell you where the problem areas are in your mix or master. It can detect things like poor EQ balance, true peak clipping, overcompression, phase issues, and other avoidable problems. You never know when your room might be lying to you or when your ears are overly fatigued, and this plugin helps give you an objective view of how your track is going to perform out there in the world. To get this plugin for free, all you have to do is join the mastering.com newsletter using the link in the description below, or you can scan the QR code you see on the screen now. Go to that page, enter your details to join the newsletter, and we'll email you a unique license code for the plugin along with instructions on how to install it. All right, pause the video now if you want to go do that, and then we can move on to the next tip. Tip number 4, manage reverb like a pro. Too much reverb, or the wrong kind of reverb, can easily wash out all the punch from your mix. But there are a few tricks you can use to add space and depth to your mix without sacrificing punch. For example, you can use pre-delay to separate the dry signal from the wet signal. Let's dial that in to give this clap track some space while still keeping it punchy and upfront in the mix. You can also use sidechain compression to achieve a similar effect. For example, let's use sidechain compression to duck the reverb whenever the snare hits. You can also use EQ to shape the tone of your reverbs. Let's clean up the reverb on these drums to help them punch through a bit more. Now, none of these tricks are a substitute for the fundamentals. Things like proper reverb selection, volume levels, and not adding too much reverb should always come first. But speaking of fundamentals, that brings us to tip number 5, use fundamental frequencies. Some instruments can be made to sound punchier by simply boosting the right frequency with some good old-fashioned EQ. For example, let's get this snare to hit harder by boosting its fundamental. For kicks, the fundamental is typically somewhere between 50 and 150 Hz. Toms typically between 70 and 200 Hz. Snares typically between 100 and 300 Hz. But these are just starting points. Every sound comes with its own unique tonal profile and should be treated as such. The number one mistake people make when it comes to getting punchier mixes is throwing a $100 bill at a $1 problem. It can be tempting to jump right to advanced techniques to get a punchier mix, but knowing that you can do something doesn't always mean that you should. Sometimes the best solution to a problem is the simplest one. That means prioritizing the basic tools and fundamental principles that can get the job done quickly and efficiently. Sometimes it's as simple as just rebalancing some instrument levels, turning the reverb down a little bit, or being honest with yourself and just saying, okay, maybe this track isn't ready for mixing yet, and going back to the production session to retrack something or rethink the arrangement. I personally have found that in most cases, the fundamental mixing tools and concepts are enough to get the punch that I'm looking for. But there's another big challenge to overcome once you've emphasized all this transient energy in your mix. And that is how to manage all of that energy and still get a loud master without distortion. We walk you through exactly how to do it. Just click the video you see on the screen now. Enjoy the next lesson.